If you have your Bible today, please open with me to the Gospel according to Luke. We will be in Luke chapter 6, and we will start in verse 31. Luke chapter 6 and verse 31. And you'll remember that we're in the middle of Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, which is not as well known, but it's very similar to his Sermon on the Mount that we have recorded in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And this is a little bit different take on some of the stuff that he says. And it adds more dimension to what he calls his disciples to. And what we're talking about in this section is his call to radical discipleship. And in particular, this section is where he's calling his people, calling his disciples to love their enemies. We're not just supposed to love our friends and our family, because that's pretty easy to do. We're not just to love the people in our church, but we're even to love our enemies, and that is much, much more difficult. Now, as you know, we did have some technological problems last week, and I thought about preaching that same sermon again because I didn't know if anybody had actually heard the whole thing. This would be the fourth time that I preached it, and because it was quite the ordeal last time, I decided not to do that. So if you didn't catch it, I'd encourage you to try and muddle through that online. But today we're going to look at Jesus' golden rule. The golden rule. Now that's something that probably you learned from your parents as kids. You may have learned it in Sunday school. You look at it and you say, okay, the golden rule, that's nice. But listen, even the godliest saint struggles to practice the golden rule. The godliest saint struggles to practice the golden rule consistently on a day-to-day basis. And as we get into it, I think you'll see it's a lot more far-reaching than what we're accustomed to think. So if you found Luke chapter 6 and verse 31, I ask you to stand with me in honor of God's word. And we will read down to verse 36. Again, Jesus is in the middle of talking about loving our neighbor, and here's what he says, verse 31. Treat others the same way you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do you good, or do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Thank you. You may be seated. Now, one of the things I said last week was that Jesus' call to love our enemies is extremely difficult, mainly because it goes counter to everything that comes naturally to us, because we only want to love people that love us back, and we want to be evil and mean and grouchy towards those people that dislike us, our enemies, those people that hate us. We want to return the favor. But this subsection of Jesus' call to love our enemies, Jesus really puts a fine point on what he's driving home. He really drives home what he's trying to get us to do. And the content here is unique to Jesus. Understand, many of the world's religions, the moralists, the ethicists of the world, they come up with something similar to what Jesus said, but their focus in the way that we respond to enemies and the way we respond to people usually either focus on the negative side of this, or it would have something to do with responding or acting towards a person in a way so that it would ingratiate them to you. It would make them want to respond kindly to you. And so Jesus kind of turns this on its head. And so the world's religions, they dealt, like I said, with the negative side of things. And so, for instance, Confucius, he said something like this. He said, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. Now, that's pretty representative of the world's view. If you don't want somebody to wrong you, don't wrong them. If you don't want somebody to gossip about you, don't gossip about them. If you don't want somebody to hit you, don't hit them. And you get the idea. And that's probably the way that most of us learn the golden rule. Well, if you want somebody to be nice to you, be nice to them, right? If you don't want somebody to be mean to you, don't be mean to them first. But Jesus' command goes much further than just the negative side. Notice, if you would, in verse 31, he does not restrict his command just to the negative. He says, treat others the way you want them to treat you. So his has a positive side. Said another way, we are called to actively do good to others. Not just not do bad, we're called to actively do good to others, even our enemies. Do you hear how much more powerful that is? It's not just don't do bad stuff, it's actually do good stuff, even to people that are our enemies. See, we can avoid certain sins by just avoiding certain activities. So, for instance, maybe we can avoid the sin of gossiping about our enemy just by not talking about our enemy. We may be able to avoid the sin of backbiting or slander or something like that simply by avoiding certain actions. Jesus doesn't call us just to avoid the sin, though. He says to treat them the way we want to be treated. It's not just the negative side, avoiding certain things. In other words, we are called to actively do good to other people, listen to this, regardless of whether or not they deserve it. We are called to do good to people regardless of whether or not they deserve it. See, we can keep the negative side of the command simply by inactivity. We cannot keep the positive side of this command by inactivity. It always requires us to do something. It requires us doing stuff to others that we would wish that people would do to us, even if they don't deserve it. Now, we know there are certain commands in Scripture that are weightier than others, right? I mean, we know that they're all equally inspired. They all come from God, but they don't all carry the same weight. So, for instance, in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 23, Jesus said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these things you should have done without neglecting the others." In other words, both in Matthew and Mark, we have a record of somebody come to Jesus, a lawyer, an expert in the law, and he puts a question to Jesus, and he says, "Teacher, master, rabbi, what's the greatest commandment in the law?" Now, Jesus did not take that opportunity to say, "Well, you're wrong here because they're all equally important." Jesus doesn't say that. Instead, he answers and tells the weightiest matters of the law. So in Mark chapter 12, verses 28 to 31, it says, "One of the scribes came and heard them arguing, and recognizing that he had answered them well, asked him, 'What commandment is the foremost of all?' Jesus answered, 'The foremost is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and ye shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." The reason I'm telling you this is because we might look at this and say, well, it's the golden rule. I learned this at home. I learned this from my parents. I learned this from my Sunday school teacher. You know, even my teachers at school said, do to people what you want them to do to you. So we can just move on past this. This must not be a weighty thing to God. But Jesus doesn't give us the option of moving the golden rule down. Instead, this is an amplification of the second greatest commandment. What did Jesus say? He said the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself. This is a restatement of that second commandment and an amplification of it. Because the command to love our neighbor as ourselves is really the fulfillment of the Old Testament law. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22, verses 39 and 40, he says, "The second is like it, you shall love your neighbors yourself. On these two commandments, to love God supremely and love your neighbors as yourself, on these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." Likewise, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets." Now, the law and the prophets is a way of talking about the Old Testament. And what Jesus is saying here is that our whole responsibility towards other people and our interaction with them is summed up in the command, love them as yourself. You say, "Pastor, I'm not sure that I'm not convinced." Paul picks up on this in Romans 13, verses 8 to 10. He says, "Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Likewise, Galatians 5:14, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Are you picking up what I'm laying down? This is not a small matter to God. This is not a small thing to Jesus. He doesn't say, here's the golden rule, treat people the way you want to be treated, and you just put that at the bottom of the list. No, this is a summation of the whole Old Testament law as it relates to our interaction with people. Now, I just want you to pause for a minute and think, what would this look like in your life if you did what Jesus said on a daily basis? What do you think would be the response to that person that you don't get along with at work, in your family, or wherever it is? You've got that person that you're kind of enemies with, maybe frenemies, mostly enemies. What if you showed them kindness? What if, as you were meeting that person in the hall, instead of kind of growling at them and glaring at them, you smiled? Not you bared your teeth, but you smiled. You spoke kindly to them. What would happen if when you were... Does anybody ever make a Sonic run? You know what I'm talking about with the Sonic run? I know that in the education field, there in Republic and some in Springfield, but especially Republic, because Sonic was right there. One of the things they did was people make a Sonic run. And what that is, if you don't know, you go to Sonic and you get a $1 soda. It'd be a large, and somebody come back, they just have big old, just tons of drinks. Hey, I'm going to Sonic. You want anything? Yeah, get me a Diet Coke or whatever. What if, when you made a Sonic run, you didn't just get it for your friends, you got it for that person that doesn't like you? Now, they may not drink it, they may think you did something to it, but what would happen if you did that and you did it consistently? What would happen if that person that really needed to trade shifts at work, their kid, their grandkid, whatever, has some kind of a thing going on, and they really need to get to it, but they were scheduled to work, and, can somebody trade shifts with me? Now, you could do it, and instead of just sitting back and smiling, knowing, they're going to be in a bad way because they can't get to that, and that's really going to stick it to them, and I love it. Instead of doing that, what if you trade shifts with that person? That way you stepped up and said, you know what? I know that's an important thing for you, for your family, for your grandkids. I'll switch with you. What do you think that would do? As you consistently did that over and over and over again, what do you think that relationship would do? See, it's easy to envision doing these things for our friends, isn't it? It's easy to envision going to Sonic and McAllister's and picking up a soda and a chocolate chip cookie. It's easy to imagine trading shifts with somebody that we like. We may do it reluctantly at times if it's an inconvenience, but what would happen if you did that even to your enemies? Because that's what Jesus is talking about. He doesn't just say, just refrain from doing bad stuff. He actually says, do good even to people that don't deserve it, regardless of what their actions are. It would revolutionize our lives. It would revolutionize our relationships. You say, Pastor, but they don't deserve it. That's the point. That's the point. We should treat others the way we would want to be treated, regardless of their worthiness. Now, we could spend a lot more time here, but we need to cover more than just one verse today. Jesus goes on, and really the rest of what he says is kind of a summation, just fleshes this out just a little bit. But if you look on past verse 31, you'll see a comparison, a contrasting of Jesus' way versus the world's way. Jesus' way versus the world's way. And so he says, for instance, you don't think you're being super godly when you love somebody that loves you back. That's easy. Even the unsaved person, even the sinner, does that. He says, don't think that you're being godly and extra special when you're kind to people who are kind to you. Why? Because the unbelieving world does that. That is not an accomplishment. Instead, we need to love the unlovable. We need to be kind to the jerks. We need to be good to them, even when they're not good to us. Now I want to highlight verses 34 and 35 because it seems to me like whenever, and maybe this is a Baptist thing, I don't know, but when we read Scripture and it says something about money in some way, that gets our attention, doesn't it? That's what we focus on. But sometimes we miss all the other stuff because he's talking about money, and that hits us right in the wallet. But if you look at verses 34 and 35, he says, he talks about lending without expecting anything in return. Now, what's he talking about? Well, what he's saying is, again, this showing kindness is more than just buying a Sonic drink, getting somebody a gift card, switching shifts or something like that. Being kind is going to look like, at least some of the time, like lending money even if you're not sure that you're going to get it back. Because what do? We think, well, if somebody says, hey man, I don't have enough money to pay my bills, can I borrow $10 from you? Can I borrow $50 from you? What do we say? In our minds, we start running the calculations. Not only do I have it, but we start saying, well, how trustworthy is this person? How likely am I to get this $10 back? How likely am I to get this $50 back? And Jesus says, this being kind and doing good to others, at least sometimes it's going to look like lending even when you're not certain you're going to get that back. Now that's hard. And Jesus, he ends his section of teaching here with a summation and an exhortation. Those are big words. What do I mean? He summarizes it and he says, love your enemies. All these things that he said, he brings it back down to where he started. Love your enemies. Love your enemies. But then he also gives an exhortation. He says, when you do that, you will be sons, you'll be daughters, you'll be children of the Most High. We don't do things to become his children. We do things because we are his children. Now, I remember growing up, I lived in a rural area. And some of you may be able to identify with this. I lived out in the country, and I went to school in town. And the town that I went to school in was really little. Now, the sign on the edge of town said there were 1,100 people in town. I don't think that sign has changed since I was a kid. I don't know if it's because everything, if the number has miraculously stayed the same for the last, 30 or 40 years or whatever it is, or because nobody cares enough to change it, I don't know. But it's a small place. The whole high school had about 200 people in it. Not a big area. Everybody knew my family because it was a small area and my grandparents had 11 kids and everybody stayed in the area. So everybody knew a Braddock. And in this town, just to kind of give you a picture, I couldn't get away with anything. Because in this town, there was one bank, there's 2 gas stations, there were a couple of schools very near each other, there's a grain elevator, and a couple other small businesses. One aunt worked at the bank. One aunt worked at the school. One aunt worked at the grain elevator. My uncle owned one of the gas stations, and 2 of his brothers worked for him. I couldn't get away with anything. It got back to mom and dad before I ever did it. And this is the type of place where you didn't have to use a turn signal because everybody knew where you're going anyway. You know what I'm talking about. That's all beside the point. Not that I would ever want to do anything naughty, but you know how it is. If I would have wanted to, I wouldn't have been able to get away with it. Anyway, people knew the Braddocks. And I can remember growing up, I guess that I looked like them because I would be introduced to somebody or introduce myself to somebody who was older, and they'd tell me, I don't know which one you belong to, but I know you're a Braddock. And maybe did anybody else ever have that experience? I don't know which one you are. I don't know which one you belong to, but you're one of the Braddock boys' kids because you look like them. You have the same mannerisms as them. You talk like them. And that's the point of what Jesus is saying. When we do these things, when we're kind to people that don't deserve it, when we are merciful, when we show compassion, when we treat others the way we want them to treat us, we are sons of the Most High. We're showing a family resemblance. Because we're acting like God. We're looking like God. Our actions say, hey, this person's in God's family. And that's the point of living this way. It is discipleship. We're learning from Jesus, and we're doing what he says. And not only what he says, but also what he did. Jesus concludes this with not only love your enemies, but the last statement he says, be merciful as your Father is merciful. Now, if we're trying to apply this message, and I hope that as I preach, you try to apply these things to your own life and think about people in your life that maybe don't like you or you don't like them. And I hope that as I preach these things, you try to apply it to yourself. And if you have, your toes are probably a little sore because this probably stepped all over them. It did mine. And maybe it's just me. But listen, this is not easy stuff. Jesus doesn't call us to a stroll in the park. He calls us to a death march. He says, deny yourselves, daily take up your cross, and follow me. See, we've romanticized the cross. The cross was an instrument of death. And he doesn't say, here it is, it's going to be all easy for you. He says, this is what I'm calling you to. I will empower you to do it. But this is not what's going to come naturally to us. And I want to encourage you to do what he's saying. Strive to implement these things in your life. Pick that person that you dislike the most. I just want you to, who is it? Don't say it. It might be me. Say it, or don't say it. Ooh, no, don't say it. Just think it. Who's the person you dislike the most? Who is the person that dislikes you the most? What is it going to look like if you do the golden rule in your relationship with that person? Maybe you don't have any interaction with that person anymore. That's fine. What about the next person? The first person that comes to your mind that you dislike the most or dislikes you the most, that you interact with. What's it going to look like if you practice the golden rule? Not just that you do the negative side, but you do the positive side. Not that you just don't slander them, but you actually do good to them. What's that going to look like? And as I said, we don't do these things in order to get saved. We do them because we are saved. And listen, if you're counting on doing this or any of the other stuff to get you to heaven, you're counting on the wrong thing. Because this will not get you to heaven. The only thing that will get you there is faith in Jesus Christ. Why don't you stand with me as musicians come. And as you stand, I ask you, bow your heads and close your eyes.